Well, good morning and welcome to Town Talks. I'm your host and your mayor, Renee Morgan. I am beyond thrilled and honored to have a former detective and Contra Costa District Attorney Paul Holz with us today. Who is Paul Holz? Well, either you've been under a rock or you're about to find out. Paul was crucial in apprehending one of the most elusive and prolific serial killers of all times, Joseph DeAngelo, ultimately known as the Golden State Killer. And some of his victims were right here in the town of Danville. Welcome, Paul. It is so nice to see you again.
Oh, it's nice to be here. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. This has got to be the police department's worst nightmare. From what I read, he raped 50 women across California, 100 break-ins, 12 murders, 10 years, at least 10 counties from Northern California, Southern California, middle of California, everywhere. And he was at large for over 40 years. But then you came along. Tell us about that.
Yep, myself and a team joined together and we used innovative technology to finally identify this guy. And this is where, over the years, we ended up getting our act together to be able to figure out who this masked man was. I got involved in this case back in 1994. And at that time, I only knew him as the East Area rapist, but because of the geographic spread of his crimes and the time frame, how long he was committing his times, press gave him multiple monikers. He had the moniker Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, Original Night Stalker, and then finally was known as the Golden State Killer. Now, as we investigated this case, and we had 44 years of law enforcement agencies, investigators trying to figure out who this guy was, when we finally identified him, turns out that he was a former police officer. And this becomes so important when assessing the types of crimes that he was doing. Down in Visalia, starting in 1974, there was a very prolific series of fetish burgs. We had a burglar going in. He was attacking inside houses in the middle of the day, going in and the women's undergarments, going after the undergarments, stealing single earrings, opening up photo albums, and doing weird things like stealing piggy banks, as well as these blue chip stamps. This was an extremely prolific burglary series, but then it turned pretty nefarious when about 80 cases in, he tries to pull 16-year-old Beth Snelling out of her house in the middle of the night. She's asleep on her bed when she has a man on top of her. He muffles her cries, he pulls her out of the house, and during the struggle, her father, Claude Snelling, tries to come to her rescue. This Visalia ransacker drops Beth, pulls a gun, shoots and kills her dad, Claude Snelling, kicks Beth in the head 3 times and runs off. He continues to offend, breaking into houses, and then ultimately is confronted by an officer as he's about to hop over a fence. When the officer lights him up with his flashlight in front of a gate to a backyard, the ransacker pulls a gun and shoots the officer. And fortunately for the officer, the bullet hit his flashlight, probably saving his life. When we identified DeAngelo, turns out that DeAngelo was a brand new Exeter police officer. Exeter is a town right next to Visalia. And when he was hired, he attended the College of Sequoias, which was right in the middle of all the burglaries that the Visalia ransacker was doing. So he was there at the time, and that was significant in assessing DeAngelo as a suspect. But then as more information came in, turns out that DeAngelo, once he was promoted to sergeant, was assigned to an anti-burglary task force. So now you literally have the Visalia ransacker most prolific burglar in Visalia history. He is now heading up the task force to try to stop burglaries. So this is where now D'Angelo has actually been sent to school on the public dime on how to investigate burglaries and learn how burglars work. Basically, the public paid D'Angelo to become a better offender. D'Angelo, 1973, this is his wedding photo when he married Sharon, who ultimately became a divorce attorney. And Officer McGowan and a college student had gotten a good view of the Visalia ransacker, and this was a composite of the Visalia ransacker produced back in 1975. And before D'Angelo was identified, I was saying to the task force that I was on, I was saying, if the East Area rapist is the Visalia ransacker, then he looks like this composite, which I didn't think so. Turns out he's a spitting image of that composite. Now, after Officer McGowan down in Visalia was attacked and shot, all the Visalia ransacker cases ceased. 6 months later, the East Area rapist starts up in Sacramento. And I'm going to break these cases down into 4 phases. Phase 1 being Sacramento-Stockton attacks. Phase 2 being Modesto Davis. Phase 3, which includes Danville, is out in the East Bay. And then phase 4 is down in Southern California when he's killing people. When he shows up as the East Area rapist in June of 1976 in Sacramento, he's described as athletic and trim, whereas the Visalia ransacker had been described as being heavy-set, kind of thick through the hips, thick thighs, but still very agile. And now that we know about D'Angelo, and you'll see his dramatic transformation after arrest, is he purposely, in my opinion, purposely lost weight because he knew that composite matched him. From the time he shot Officer McGowan to the time he starts attacking, he changed his physical build. And he actually adopts a very different look. And I know I struggled with whether or not the Visalia ransacker and the East Area rapist were the same offenders because of the extreme difference in the appearance. Now I'm going to break the attacks down. Once he starts as the East Area rapist, he is now attacking all over the East Area of Sacramento. That's how he got the moniker East Area rapist. He's not the East Bay rapist, as many people down in the Bay Area think he was. He's East Area from Sacramento. First 15 attacks up in Sacramento, he's only attacking women or teenage girls. And then starting with attack 16, he is now attacking couples in the middle of the night as they were asleep in their bed. 2 different MOs, if there's a man present or not, with women only inside the house. And oftentimes there were kids. The women had kids in their own bedrooms inside the house. The East Area rapist would go in while the woman was asleep in her bed, and he would immediately go hands-on. He would get her face down, bind her wrists behind her back, and he would be through these clenched teeth, this harsh whisper, telling her to do what he said or he would kill her. Sometimes he would put a knife up against her neck or poke her in the side with that knife. And then he would go through the house, do some light ransacking, come back and sexually assault the woman. Starting with attack number 16, this is with a man present. He adopts a different MO, and it's to minimize the threat of the male to him. He goes into the couple's bedroom in the middle of the night. Typically, they were asleep. He doesn't go hands-on. He stays away. He shines a flashlight in their eyes, waking them up. So they're completely blinded by this bright light. He always wore a ski mask. In fact, even with just women, he always had a mask on. Nobody ever saw his face throughout this entire series. When there was a man present, as he's standing there at the foot of the bed, blinding them with the flashlight, he let the couple know that he had a gun. And he would often put the gun in the beam of the light so they could see it and know that he was telling the truth. And then he would issue threats such as, do what I say, or I will spatter your brains all over the wall. I have a .357 Magnum with 2 clips, he would say. And then he would toss bindings to the woman and make her bind her husband or boyfriend up. And the man had to be face down, and his wrists were bound behind his back, and then his ankles would be bound. And once the man was incapacitated, now the attacker would go over, make the woman lie face down, and bind her wrists and ankles the same way. He would then go through the house and then come back with plates, dishes, or some other trinkets that he would put on the man's back as an alarm system and tell the man, if I hear these, she's dead, or I'll kill everything in the house, referring to the children. He would then take the woman out to the family room where he would sexually assault her. So 2 different MOs based on who he was attacking. And here in these images, you can see he often went through the woman's purse. He would look at her driver's license and start calling the woman by her first name, which would, of course, upset the woman, thinking he knows me from somewhere. Most of the crime scenes in Northern California, these victims, of course, survived. And so typically they're frantically, once he left, trying to get the bindings off. And the binding material was typically shoelaces. Some of the shoelaces he brought himself, and other shoelaces he would take from the victim's own shoes, just to augment what he had brought.
Is Paul, that's something that you also found at one of the scenes, which made you link him to one of the attacks, was you found shoelace, and the way it was tied made you realize it was him. Is that correct?
That's up in Sacramento. That's a double homicide with Maggiore. So you had pre-tied shoelace right next to the male victim's body in the backyard. And it was right in his prime hunting grounds in Sacramento. And I will actually show where that case happened. So, and here's an example of the dishes in this particular case that the East Area Rapist used as an alarm system. So when you start taking a look at phase 1, Sacramento, Stockton, he does 22 attacks spread all over the East Area, Sacramento, Rancho Cordova, Citrus Heights, Fair Oaks, Orangevale. Then he goes down after the 22nd attack. For the 23rd attack, he's all the way down south in Stockton. He attacks a couple down there, goes back to 6 more attacks up in Sacramento, and then back down to Stockton. He's toggling back and forth between the 2 jurisdictions. And very quickly, because he had such a distinctive MO, Sacramento authorities knew that the East Area Rapist was now out of their city down there in Stockton. Rancho Cordova turns out to be huge when it comes to D'Angelo. We knew it was significant to the East Area Rapist because this is the strongest cluster of attacks in the entire series, where we have basically 6, 5 bona fide, 1 maybe attack in this Cordova Meadows neighborhood in Rancho Cordova. D'Angelo lived in the neighborhood just south of here, growing up in high school. He attended Folsom High School because Cordova High School didn't exist at the time and was being bussed out to Folsom. After the media caught on to the Golden State Killer and D'Angelo's name was put out there, Sacramento DA's office received a phone call from a former high school friend of D'Angelo's saying, "We used to burglarize this very neighborhood in high school." So here you have the East Area Rapist going back to his former hunting grounds as a young teenage boy to start doing his sexual assaults once he graduated to the sexual assault aspect. He's going where he's comfortable. Typically in his attacks, he's looking for open windows, open doors, but he was able to get into pretty much any house he wanted to get into. In this particular attack, he's just prying open the screen door as well as the slider and walks into the couple's master bedroom that was just off the pool. Here, in this particular case, and this is the first Stockton attack, he ends up, there's a landline phone outside. And he just merely takes that phone and tosses it over a branch in the tree. And as you know, if you take any phone off the hook for the phone system of these old landlines, you've disabled the phones for the whole house. And so even when these victims were able to get their bindings off, they could not call out. And these attacks were occurring in the days before 911. So when they did call, they're typically having to wait for the operator. At a certain point after the sexual assault, with the couple still bound inside, D'Angelo would often just partake in the couple's crackers, the snacks. If there was beer, he'd drink their beer. Here in this particular case, he's enjoying their Pepsi out in the backyard, while the couple is still just scared to death, wondering what he's going to do next. In this case here, you can see where the shoes have been just stripped of all their shoelaces, because that's what he used to tie up the victims. He's using the victim's own binding material. And again, the plates that were put on the male's back, this plate was broken by the victims to get a sharp edge to cut through the bindings. And he also went through and would steal, and he notably would steal coins and jewelry. And if he ran across cash, he would take that. There was a financial component to the items that D'Angelo was taking. However, there were also souvenirs. He would take some of the women's driver's licenses with their photos on them. He probably kept some of the jewelry items as souvenirs. And quite frankly, to this day, none of his victims' souvenirs have been recovered. Of note, when he would separate the woman out into the family room where he would do the sexual assault, one of the things that he would do would turn the TV on. And this would be often, 2 a.m., 3 a.m. in the morning. It'd just be that staticky background from back in the day with the old broadcasts. And he would turn the sound off, but then put a towel or other type of, like a blanket, over the TV to dim the glow from the TV. Now, why is he doing that? Well, he wants to see what he's doing with this woman during the sexual assault. He also enjoyed watching the fear on his victim. When I walked into D'Angelo's bedroom after arrest, and I'm taking a look at what his bedroom setup was, the first thing I noticed is his computer monitor right inside the front door on the right-hand side. He had a towel draped over it. And I thought, he's reliving what he used to do to his victims in his very own room. So Renee, this is the case that you're talking about. You have a double homicide, February 2nd, 1978, up there in Sacramento. Brian and Katie Mazur are just out walking a dog, and it appears Brian, a former military policeman, gave chase to the East Area rapist and cornered him in a backyard. And we actually have a teenage boy who witnesses Brian being shot, and then that offender running around the corner of the house, losing sight of the offender, and then hearing Katie scream before you have a single gunshot that was done at close range to the top of her head. Both victims died, but right next to Brian was that pre-tied shoelace that the East Area rapist would bring with him to bind his victims up. So it's very possible, out walking their dog, they ran across East Area rapist as he was out prowling, and he recognized that I can't get away, and he ends up killing this couple. And this is in that Rancho Cordova neighborhood that D'Angelo had such a strong association with. Now, phase 2 becomes very interesting, because starting with attack 33, the East Area rapist is all the way down in Modesto. That's a 2-hour drive south of Sacramento. After he attacks a couple down there, within 2 days, he's up in Davis, 110 driving miles, attacking a 19-year-old UC Davis student in her apartment. A couple of weeks go by, he's back down in Modesto. And then within 24 hours, he's all the way back up in Davis again. So he's doing this really interesting toggle between Modesto and Davis. And then a week later, July 6, 1978, he attacks a woman inside her house while her kids were asleep in the bedroom. This particular case is interesting because as he is raping the woman, the offender, the East Area rapist, is sobbing and is making the statement, "I hate you, Bonnie. I hate you, Bonnie," over and over again. And we always knew this man had a woman that was significant to him with the name Bonnie. When we first were learning about D'Angelo, we ran across this newspaper article from 1970 where D'Angelo had been engaged to a Bonnie. And I could find no record of a marriage between Joe D'Angelo and Bonnie. In fact, in 1973, he ends up marrying a woman named Sharon. So it's like, oh, here's a relationship that looks like it went sideways. And sure enough, I've become friends with Bonnie since D'Angelo's arrest. And the relationship went very sideways. And her story is out there now. So if you have any interest, there's a podcast, Man in the Window, and you can hear Bonnie's story and what it was like being engaged to who ultimately became the Golden State Killer. Okay, so now, after that weird Modesto Davis phase, starting in October 1978, the East Area Rapist shows up in Contra Costa County in Concord. He does 2 attacks in the very same Concord neighborhood, just northwest of Treat and Oak Grove, and then proceeds over the course of the next almost year, not quite 9 months, to be attacking in cities from Concord all the way as far south as San Jose. He's following the 680 corridor. And so in this case, he does the 2 attacks in Concord, and then his next attack is all the way down in San Ramon, then he's down in San Jose, then he's back up in Danville. He ends up doing several attacks in Walnut Creek as well as in Fremont. So he is following the 680 corridor. And what's notable about this is his pattern doesn't match what I was seeing up in Sacramento, where he's crisscrossing that east area of Sacramento. This is a linear driving pattern. And this is where I assessed it, saying he's never moved down to the East Bay. He is coming down here for whatever reason and dropping off the freeway and committing these attacks. And I thought, you know, this guy, he is Sacramento based. He was Sacramento based back then, and I felt pretty confident he was still Sacramento based to this day. And that was one of the things I got right. And I got many things wrong in this case, but that was one of the things I got right. In Concord, that very first attack, it's notable because this shows the East Area Rapist's skill sets as a burglar. Is he initially tries to get into this couple's house by going through the side garage door, but they had a security bar on the back side of the door. He couldn't get through. So he ends up resorting to plan B, where he goes to the front of the house and he literally punches a dime-size hole in the glass so he could undo the window lock latch and slide the window open. And then what he does after that is he ends up putting the window screen back on after he's climbed into the house to make it look like nothing is happening. And this kind of shows, this is, you've got the BART tracks here, is that window faced a prime road in that neighborhood. And he had the wherewithal to cover his tracks to make sure anybody driving or walking by wouldn't know, uh-oh, looks like that house has been broken into. So it just shows he's thinking as he's going in. And this is where I was starting to get a better sense that I'm dealing with somebody who's a little bit more sophisticated, a little bit more intelligent than what many of the early investigators thought, because they just were really focusing in on some of these kind of sex deviant, hobo type guys just that were rolling around the countryside. Down in San Jose, he just punches a hole in the window glass and pries up one of those track locks. So if he wanted to get into a house, he could. In that third attack up in Davis, the victim had wooden dowels in all the window tracks. And after punching a hole and unlocking the window, he ends up using some sort of tool and fishes the wood dowel out of the track. So he got in, even though the victim thought that she had her house secure. Now in Danville. Danville became very important to me for many reasons. We had 3 attacks that occurred. The first attack down here started in, that was December of 1978. So to orient you, here you've got the Sycamore Valley Road, you got 680, and then taking Camino Ramon, you go down and take a left on Paraiso, and his first attack was on Liberta Court. The the attack location, when the bloodhounds scented his escape route was along the recently defunct, at that time, Southern Pacific Railroad tracks, now known as the Iron Horse Trail. And they scented south along those tracks and lost the scent right where those railroad tracks crossed El Capitan. So that's likely where the East Area Rapist got into his vehicle and left. And this was a typical tactic that the East Area Rapist would use, is he would park a distance away and walk to the location. And he would approach the location from one direction and escape from another direction to prevent witnesses from seeing him coming and going. In this particular attack, near where his vehicle was found, there was some paperwork that had been dropped, including this hand-drawn diagram. And this diagram, I spent years of my life pursuing, and I got feedback saying this looks like a developer trying to lay out a proposed neighborhood, just sketching out some ideas. And there were some unusual symbols and some progressive aspects within this development. So I thought the offender was a developer or something along those lines, was working in that field. Now that D'Angelo, a former police officer, has been identified, I have no idea if this diagram is even related. And only D'Angelo possibly can answer that question. On the back of the diagram, you had the word punishment scrawled. You had some women's names, last name, first name of Jen or Jenny. Got Melanie that's possibly crossed out. What is going on here? Entirely consistent with this coming from the East Area Rapist. The second attack in Danville, and this is a little bit of a fuzzy aerial photo that happened from the sheriff's criminalist at the time, took this from the helicopter, but it happened on Allegheny Way. And here you can see 680. You can see Camino Ramon here, and I'm going to go to a clearer photo. And then here is El Capitan off of Camino Ramon. Now, notably, and this is why it's so important to know what existed at the time of the case that is being checked into. This is now 1979. Notice, if you're familiar with this particular neighborhood, there's that tall sound wall that's been erected. 1979, that sound wall did not exist between the freeway and Camino Ramon. So as he's driving up and down 680, he could easily see this neighborhood from the freeway. And one of the interesting aspects about the East Area Rapist is he very rarely attacked in a neighborhood that had two-story houses, because he liked to use backyards to be able to prowl. And when you have two-story houses, you have witnesses on the second floor that can look down into their neighbor's backyard. So it's very possible he saw that this neighborhood met his criteria, dropped off the freeway and started prowling and made the decision, yes, I'm going to be attacking here. And he could pick any neighborhood and find a victim. The third attack happened off of Camino Tasajara, off of Thornburg Way in a condominium complex. And in this attack, the husband, a notoriously light sleeper, kind of sensed something, looks at the foot of his bed and sees the East Area Rapist pulling a mask down. So the husband immediately gets up and confronts the offender. The wife runs out. The offender's sitting there just staring at this man who's yelling at him. And the offender realizes this is done, and he runs out, the husband runs out. And this is the very last, basically, case that we have to the East Area Rapist in Northern California. He just disappears from the face of the earth. This is July of '79. And at this point, task forces in Sacramento and Contra Costa County had been formed. When no more attacks were occurring, they thought he's moved on or he's dead, and they disband, and this case goes cold in Northern California. Of interest is 2 weeks after that attack, this photo shows up in the newspaper. Actually, this is 2 weeks after that Allegheny Way attack. This photo was taken, and this is D'Angelo in police uniform at a Little League game, doing his typical police officer charity type of functions. So now I know exactly what D'Angelo looked like behind that mask at the time of the Danville attacks. And the D'Angelo, turns out, within weeks of that last attack in Danville, he got arrested for shoplifting, dog repellent, and a hammer up in Citrus Heights. And he's arrested by Sacramento. He was an Auburn police officer. The Auburn chief ends up putting him on administrative leave and then ultimately terminates him. Now that becomes important in assessing, well, why did the Golden State Killer move down south? Because after that termination from Auburn, that's when D'Angelo is down in Southern California, where there was a series of homicides. And down there, they didn't know that this was actually the East Area Rapist. I had basically linked the East Area Rapist to these homicides using DNA back in 2001. But at the time these cases were happening, they had no idea that this was a very prolific serial rapist from Northern California. In the very first attack, it's a typical East Area Rapist style attack. He gets the couple bound on their bed. The male is left bound in the bedroom. The woman is separated. But in this case, he ends up pacing back and forth saying, I'm going to kill them. I'm going to kill him this time. Well, the woman hears this. Her ankles weren't bound at the time. She gets up and runs towards the front door. The offender runs after her, catches up. She screams. The male hears that. He ends up hopping out the sliding door and hides in the bushes. Next door neighbor is an FBI agent who grabs his gun and runs out to see the offender on a bicycle, biking away. The agent goes and gets in his car and gives chase. The offender ends up bailing the bike, hops fences, which he was very good at, and disappears. This is a case that went sideways, just like the last case up there in Danville. And this is down in Goleta, California, Santa Barbara area. 2 months later, just a few blocks away from that first Santa Barbara case, we have a double homicide of Dr. Offerman and Dr. Mandy. It appears that the offender came in, bound the couple, left the bedroom. When he came back in, Offerman had slipped his bindings and tried to stand up and run at the offender. The offender shoots Offerman, catching him in the neck with the bullet, as well as other shots to the torso. Offerman is killed. He goes over and shoots Deborah Manning, who's bound face down in the bed, shoots her in the top of the head and runs off. Here's another case that didn't go as planned. So now we have 3 cases in a row that went sideways. March of 1980, 3 months later, we have Lyman and Charlene Smith found bludgeoned to death in their bed in Ventura, a little further south in Santa Barbara. What's notable about this case is Lyman Smith was a former district attorney, and he had left the DA's office, became a defense attorney. And at that time, Governor Jerry Brown was considering appointing him as a judge. So he's a fairly high status victim in this series. In this case, they're both bound in their bed. They've been bludgeoned with a log that was found on the side of the house by the offender. And we have DNA evidence in this case. And ultimately, the DNA found from Charlene's sexual assault kit, it was what was used to identify D'Angelo. 6 months go by, and then down in a gated community, kind of an upper scale community, Laguna Niguel, right there on the coast, we have Keith and Patrice Harrington, who are found bludgeoned to death in their bed, just like Lyman and Charlene Smith. So the Golden State Killer had 3 cases go sideways, and then with Lyman and Charlene Smith, he does what he wants to do. He gets them bound, he sexually assaults the woman, and then he bludgeons the couple. Now, in this case with the Harringtons, he maintains that same pattern. That's exactly what he wanted to do. We also have DNA in this case, so that had previously been linked to the Ventura case. Another 6 months go by. So as the East Area Rapist, he is attacking multiple times a week. He's very prolific. When he becomes the original Night Stalker and is killing, now he has 6 months. It's like biannual when he's doing his attacks. Manuela Whitton was found bludgeoned to death in her bed. She had been bound, but her bindings had been removed. And her husband just happened to be at the hospital. He had some sort of virus. And he was actually looked at as a suspect. And some people thought, well, how did this offender know Manuela would be alone? And well, he probably didn't. And if her husband had been inside the house in that bed that night, her husband probably would have been dead right next to her. So in many ways, this virus, this hospitalization probably saved her husband's life. DNA was also used to link her case to the series. And then in July of 1981, back up in Santa Barbara, we have Greg Domingo and Sherry. We have Sherry Domingo and Gregory Sanchez, who are killed. Both have been bludgeoned, but it appears that Greg ends up getting into a physical fight with the offender. And in this case, it's very possible that Greg scared D'Angelo, because after this, we don't have another case for 5 years. 5 years go by, and then down in Irvine, the same city where Manuela Whittoon was bludgeoned, we have pretty 19-year-old Janelle Cruz, who's bludgeoned and had been raped in her bed. Her family had gone down to Mexico for a vacation, and she was home alone. This is the only case in which the offender bludgeoned the victim in the face. He always bludgeoned to the back of the head, but in this case, she's face up when she's being killed. And again, there's also DNA from Janelle's case linking her to the series. So as I'm working this case, I had done everything I possibly could do from a DNA standpoint. And then even starting in 2012, tried a different type of genealogy with DNA, YSTRs, this male DNA, hoping to figure out the offender's last name. And spent years pursuing various leads based off of that, and then found out about this newer genealogy, which is the technology that Ancestry.com and 23andMe are using, and working with a genetic genealogist. And I had an FBI attorney, Steve Kramer from the Orange County office, as my partner. We ended up pursuing this type of genealogy, which is a DNA segment triangulation process. It's what adoptees can use to identify their biological parents. And it's turned out to be quite the powerful technology. But fundamentally, there was a small team of us, there were 6 of us, that did the genealogy work. And eventually we settled down, going through and taking a look at individuals within these genetic databases, which we use, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and MyHeritage. We were able to track back to common ancestors of the Golden State Killer, and then ultimately identify D'Angelo as potentially a suspect. And then at this point, now we are marching down on D'Angelo. I'm trying to call Bonnie. I reach out to the former police chief that fired him up in Auburn. And that police chief ends up telling me that, when during the termination process, his teenage daughter comes into his room and says, "Daddy, there's a man standing outside my bedroom window shining a flashlight into it." And the chief told me, "I know that was D'Angelo." And at that point, it was like, okay, we got to get this guy's DNA. And then ultimately, FBI and SAC put him under surveillance. He was arrested. His DNA was collected and matched the Golden State Killer. And now he's pled guilty and has admitted to the crimes that he wasn't charged with, and is serving life in prison. And quite frankly, if it hadn't been for the genealogy tool, all of us that were on this task force, we weren't sure we would have ever solved the case based on the leads we were pursuing. So with that is a very brief and quick summary of the Golden State Killer case, with a little bit of a focus on the Danville attacks. And I will turn this over back to the mayor for questions.
Thank you, Paul. What a fascinating and a long drawn out process. Did you ever suspect that he had police or military training?
Over the years, there was thought that he had some sort of training. In fact, there was some investigation by Sacramento that was he from special forces because of the heavy military aspect. Now, The police tactics, the shining the flashlight in the eyes was something that, of course, was notable. But I know I took the position we can't rely on that in terms of narrowing a suspect pool, because a reasonably intelligent and sophisticated offender like the East Area Rapist would do those types of tactics. It doesn't require special training. So it's one of those things, in hindsight, it stands out. And numerous police officers were investigated over the decades, but it never dropped down onto D'Angelo as somebody who was part of the suspect list.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I know that Contra Costa Sheriff kept a lot of the evidence, which was pivotal in the case as well. And that wasn't done before. Why did you do that? And what made you want to hold on to that evidence?
Well, that was huge, and that's some of the I had in the case, because Contra Costa Sheriff's Office is the only office that ended up preserving the East Area Rapist evidence. All the other agencies in Northern California just destroyed all their East Area Rapist evidence out of a matter of routine, just because statute of limitations. Sexual assaults back in the day were 6 years from. So I actually had DNA evidence to work with. As I was working over time, I would be consulting with the DA's office, and most notably Mary Nunn, who I'd worked many cases with, saying, hey, I've got this, I've got that. I had a couple suspects who were developed in Danville. I'd hit Mary up and say, how can I, is this legal? Can I do a DUI ruse or something like that? I had the advantage of having DNA from the East Area Rapist, whereas nobody else in Northern California had that.
So didn't it start though? I mean, I know we kept the information up here in Contra Costa County, but wasn't it Southern California that first came up with the DNA and the DNA markers before it came in? It took a while to get back up to Northern California. Is that right?
What ended up happening is Southern California is investigating their cases. There's a connection to Northern California. So they end up doing DNA. It was doing DNA work. And this is 1997. And then I reached to Costa Sheriff's investigator, Larry Crompton. And he was the one that said, you get DNA, who's your top suspect? And he says, we eliminated all our top suspects, but we all went south. And he pointed me to Santa Barbara. And I called Santa Barbara, who then, through sort of a phone investigation, I landed with the Orange County Sheriff's Crime. We had DNA, but different technologies. And then 4 years later, we standardized to the same technology. And that's when the link was made in 2001. So we kind of did it in parallel. And then it worked out over the course of about 5 years.
The things I'm sure have changed now. So a little bit faster now, things have changed. What I do want to do is I want to make sure that we have time for questions, because I know that we have quite a few. And I'm going to ask Kat, are there any questions from the audience?
Yeah, so our first question is kind of going to the end, just in terms of, for you, Paul, when you retired, this case had not closed. So how was that like for you, retiring with that still open?
Well, that was a hard thing for me, as I wanted to solve this case before I retired. And we were frantically working the genealogy, and I knew we were close, and I had focused in on D'Angelo in that last week before I retired. And the very last thing I did before I retired was drive up to his house and sit in front of his house, just wondering, is he the guy or not? I was fortunate in that the genealogy team I was working with, the FBI, SAC DA's office, kept me on board even as a retiree. And then once he was identified, then SAC Sheriff Homicide brought me up, and then I helped co-author the arrest warrant on D'Angelo. So I was just fortunate that they kept me involved in the process. They easily could have said, nope, you're no longer part of us, but they kept me as part of the team.
It must have, I mean, from my standpoint, I remember when he got arrested, and they actually got his DNA, from what I understand, off of his door handle, and then a tissue or something of some sort from his garbage can. But for you, having watched him and seeing that he was, riding a motorcycle and doing work in his yard and all of those other things, and then to see him sitting in a wheelchair, what did that make you think?
Well, I knew exactly what was going on. This guy is trying, he is sitting there always thinking. He is the ultimate tactician. He's trying, how can I minimize this, to myself? And so now I've got to pretend to be the frail old man. But when he was under surveillance, he was seen riding his motorcycle 100 miles an hour through residential streets. He was seen doing the yard work. They're saying this guy moves around, even though he's in his 70s, like a 50-year-old man. And at one point, he ends up doing counter surveillance. He gets on the freeway, and the surveillance team is following him, and he's doing counter surveillance moves to see if he's being followed or not. So we don't know if he made the team at that point, or if he's just generally paranoid and would do it from time to time.
But he obviously stayed in the area, so he probably didn't think anybody was on to him. I mean, he got away with it for over 40 some odd years. Do you think that he felt that you were onto him?
No, I think we think that the FBI had a plane up, and an off-duty agent who lived near D'Angelo was out playing with his son in the backyard and looked up and says, "Oh, our plane's awfully low." And so they think that hinked D'Angelo up, and that's why he ended up. He drove to the Sac airport and then pulled off the side, just to see who was following him. It's who knows if he made the team or not. They backed away, but then they got right back on it because we had to get that DNA sample. Mm-hmm. Now I have a question here about how did the arrest go down, and Sac Sheriff did utilize a special fugitive apprehension team, and I won't divulge their tactics because it's something that they do on a frequent basis, but they completely surprised him out in front of his house to the point where he had no ability to physically resist. He gets hooked up, he gets put in the back of a van, and then the very famous statement he makes is, "But I've got a roast cooking in the oven." And in many ways, I think it's possible that he wanted to get back into his house where he had his cache of firearms. And possibly, go down in a blaze of glory. But fortunately, they didn't bite. And, fundamentally, he never had the ability to physically resist. And during the interview, he never said a word in response to any of the questions.
Did he really have a roast in the oven?
No.
I didn't think so. Kat, do you have any more questions?
Yeah, so our next question is, when the retired FBI agent chased him and he left that bike behind, did they check the bike for DNA, for fingerprints? Did he have gloves on?
Yeah, so the bike was a stolen parole officer's bike who lived in that very neighborhood. They did collect the bike. They stole, they fingerprinted the bike. Now, of course, this case is in 1979, so there was no swabbing of the bike for DNA. And I don't know if he had gloves on at the time that he's riding that bike. However, the East Area rapist would typically wear gloves, occasionally taking them off for the sexual assault. But when he is initially going into the house and when he's leaving the house and he's interacting with, drawers and stuff as he's ransacking, he had his gloves on.
Progressive. I mean, he went from just doing basic burglaries to going into raping and then murder. What do you think the stressor was? I mean, he also had 3 daughters, from what I understand, or he has 3 daughters, and was married, living that type of life. What was the stressor for him to escalate like that? I mean, have you ever figured that out?
Well, I think, he most certainly, we see as a younger kid that he definitely had, I mean, he was doing burglaries as a high schooler, and he's probably doing, he was probably peeping at that age, and then escalated. Something I didn't talk about, but in that Rancho Cordova neighborhood in 73 and 74, he's probably the Cordova cat burglar, breaking into houses while people are inside the house. This is your typical evolution. Going into house, peeping, going into houses when no one's present, going into houses when somebody's present, going into houses and sexually assaulting. The stressor, he was a criminal justice major at Sac State. He was a Roseville PD.
So a smart man.
He's a reasonably smart guy. He's criminally justice focused. He likes the power and authority that law enforcement gave him. He's an ex-Air cop, he was an ex-Air sergeant, he was an Auburn police officer. So his life was centered around law enforcement, and then he gets terminated. And it's after he's terminated, that's when you get the homicides. And then there you have, now this thing that's so important to him has been stripped away. And that's where it goes from sexual assault to homicides.
Yeah, and what a strange thing to be stealing, dog repellent, and it just doesn't make any sense. And to risk your career for something like that, it seems as though he would know better than that as well. Right.
Yeah, well, the dog repellent he probably was using during his prowlings to train the dog so they wouldn't come after him when he'd go in to do the sexual assaults, sort of a negative training thing ahead of time. But he also, in addition, the chief told me he had all sorts of stolen commercial property, like power tools, still in their brand new boxes, never opened inside his house when they were doing the IA investigation. They never charged him with those crimes. But I, to this day, go, I bet he had the souvenirs from his attack somewhere in that house. If they had only searched a little bit more, but
exactly,
there's no way they would have ever linked D'Angelo at that time as being the East Area rapist.
Now, I can only imagine you going to this little dusty old file and opening it up and looking in there and seeing the EAR on there. And what drew you to that particular unsolved case?
Well, it was really the first cold case that I ran across, and I just stumbled across it in the crime lab's library, and it was in a drawer that I'd never seen anybody go into. And so I'm looking at it, and I had just finished reading a book called Sexual Homicide: Patterns and Motives. This was written by John Douglas, Bob Ressler, Dr. Ann Burgess, and is the academic text for the Netflix show Mindhunter. The early days of profiling. So I was already kind of really fascinated with the idea of the serial predator. And now I'm looking at this serial rapist case file going, I wonder if this is solved. And I was training in DNA at the time. So I was like, I wonder if I could use DNA to solve this case, not thinking that it would lead to ultimately the Golden State Killer series.
Now, his name evolved as well. I mean, he was known as like 3 or 4 different names. And then you had Richard Ramirez, who actually ended up being the Night Stalker. How did that happen?
Well, his names, of course, those monikers are typically given by the media. And
right.
So, as he's attacking in different jurisdictions, because he's attacking all over California, the local media name him. So Visalia Ransacker, East Area Rapist, original Night Stalker. He actually was the Night Stalker, but then Richard Ramirez got tapped as the Night Stalker. So they now had to refer to the cases in Santa Barbara, Orange County, and Ventura as, well, this is the original Night Stalker, predating Ramirez.
Okay, so Kat, do you have some more questions for us?
Yeah, I have one more question that kind of expands on when we were talking about just what his stressors were. And this is actually a question that I'm curious to know the answer to. How, for so many years, was he able to get away with this and just really live a normal life? It's like switching between these roles.
Yeah. Well, most certainly he could not get away with this series today. This is where technology would prevent something like this from happening with the prevalent home security systems, cameras everywhere, license plate readers, cell phone technology, etc. Back in the day, his law enforcement training, he utilized to his advantage. And I believe he probably had a scanner in his car. He got familiar with, the police beats, particularly up there in Sacramento. And he understood, what evidence could be used to identify him. Now, he had some close calls, so he had luck on his side as well to get away with as many attacks that he did. What was the second part of that question? Oh,
Just going between the two roles of living a normal life and.
Well, and this is something that these predators like a D'Angelo, they compartmentalize. They have their crime compartment, and then they have their normal life. And one of the big questions about D'Angelo is well, how does D'Angelo identify himself? One of the notorious serial offenders that I think is most similar to D'Angelo in terms of personality and intelligence is BTK, Dennis Rader. And when he's arrested, he was president of his church. He was married. He, participated in his son's Boy Scout stuff. He looked like the great family man. But when he was arrested, he said, that's all a facade. I'm BTK. So Dennis Rader identified as the predator, not as the family man. With D'Angelo, we don't know how he identifies. He has 3 daughters. He had grandchildren. He would take his grandchildren out, trick-or-treating. He built his grandkids, this nice kind of playhouse in the backyard. And I have a feeling that he identifies as Joe D'Angelo, the grandfather. I think he's different than BTK that way. But until we get an opportunity to sit down and talk with him and have him really open up to us, I just don't know really, how he got away with it. I just knew that, I had my boss at the DA's office saying, Paul, he's dead. He's dead. And I was like, no, I think he's possibly still alive and he's out there. And sure enough, he was up there, going to Hobby Lobby routinely, building his little remote control planes and, participating in his daughters and grandkids' lives and fishing. He was a big fisherman, and had friends. So he was living a normal life for sure.
His friends still believe, and his daughters, that there's a possibility that the DNA is incorrect. Is that true as well? Do they still believe that he could be innocent?
Well, I know early on, one of his friends that he went fishing with was just, it can't be him. The DNA must be wrong. The daughters, I've never heard what their thought is. I know the 2 daughters that were at the SAC homicide when I was there, they were sobbing when I saw them, but they're both. One these are his second and third daughters, middle daughter and youngest daughter. The middle daughter is an ER doctor. The youngest daughter was a postgraduate student at UC Davis. Very, very smart. It was explained to them, we've got the DNA. So I got to think that they could reason it through, knowing. And now that he's actually been up in front of the world and said, I am the Golden State Killer. He admits everything. I mean, there is no question. The DNA is not wrong.
So getting back to DNA, and I admit it. I mean, I've put my name, my DNA into the 23andMe, and I've done the genealogy type of stuff, right? Ancestries and all that. And what happens when you put your information in there? How does it automatically go out to anybody that's researching it? How safe is it to do something like that? And should we all be doing that?
So in terms of how safe is it? I didn't get into it. I flashed up a screen of like a GEDmatch search result, and that was a screen off of my dad's DNA, because as I was learning it, I used my own family's own DNA to try to figure out how to do it. And typically what I do is I point out, well, this is what I can see. And all I was able to see when you get this type of search result is whatever identifying information the person puts in, their email address, their name, or whose DNA it is, and then how much DNA is shared with the person that they're related to.
Right. The percentage, right? Isn't it like the percentage?
It's like the amount of DNA. It's
right.
measured in centimorgans. But I at no point as a law enforcement officer, ever had access to anybody's genetic information within these genealogy databases. All I get is these are people, this is how much DNA they share, and based on the amount of DNA they share, that tells me, oh, they're second cousins, they're third cousins, they're fourth cousins. And that instructs the law enforcement investigators and the genealogists, well, this is how far back in time we have to build the family trees in order to ultimately identify who we're looking for through traditional genealogy, census records, obituaries, findagrave.com.
Wow.
To be frank, putting your DNA in those databases, I think your bigger worry is, well, where else is that DNA going to end up? Who else is going to look at it? I would be more worried about, maybe insurance side, health side, than how law enforcement is using it in order to solve the worst of the worst types of cases.
Right. So if you have a criminal in your DNA somewhere back there, you're actually helping the police. And so it's actually a good thing for those reasons, but not for others. So, from my standpoint, I look at DNA and I look at how far it's come. Do you think that with what we have right now in police technology and just technology in general, that crimes like that can actually take place in today's day and age?
Well, like I mentioned before, here you have with Golden State Killer, you have, he had over 100 burglaries and a homicide in Visalia. He had 50 attacks in Northern California where he's breaking into houses and he's prowling neighborhoods. And then the homicides down in Southern California. I do not see how somebody could get away with that type of crime for that length of time. I mean, you most certainly could do multiple attacks, but pretty soon technology is going to catch up with you today.
Right.
Whether it be surveillance technologies with cameras, surveillance systems that people have on their houses, or license plate readers that law enforcement is using, or
right. Danville has that as well.
Yeah. Well, there you go. So that's everywhere. So now, from what I've seen, is that predators have shifted from going to victims to luring victims and isolating victims.
Oh.
And your sophisticated offenders, of course, are using the online side in order, you've got your child molesters out there that are trying to lure the kids physically to a location where now you don't have their surveillance, where they are able to get contact. So that's, it is a cat and mouse game between law enforcement and the criminals. And the criminals are looking for avenues to circumvent, the technology. But DNA is, during the commission of a violent crime, there's so many dynamics that happen, is that no matter what the offender does to try to prevent leaving DNA, there's always a chance that they could. All of a sudden, the victim is able to punch them in the nose, and you got some blood drips at the crime scene that they were not expecting that they would be leaving behind.
Right.
So those things happen during these types of crimes.
Well, you've done so much, and I want to be cognizant of your time as well. But I just can't thank you enough for being here, sharing your information with all of us. I know you say you're retired, but what's up next for Paul Holz?
Well, that's still to be decided. I do have a book that that's going to be about my career, and of course Golden State Killer, and some of the the background on that and the inside information about what I was going through to try to find this guy it will be in there. I'm waiting to hear if America's Most Wanted is going to be re-upped, and then I have multiple potential projects going on, and I still have my podcast, Jensen and Holz, the Murder Squad, in which we talk about some unsolved aspect of a case that we reach out to the listeners. Hey, can we help law enforcement try to solve this unsolved case or unsolved aspect of a case.
Well, whatever you decide to do, you know that you've got a fan club here in Danville, and we'll definitely be watching. So thank you so much for being here today. And to our audience that's out there today, thank you all for joining us today. We hope you enjoyed today's program. I know I did. We look forward to seeing you next month. And in the meantime, stay positive, test negative, and keep in touch. Thank you all for being here today.